Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Noveltea Corner, and welcome to my Allegiance of Honor recap and review. So Allegiance of Honor is the 15th and final book in the Psy-Changeling series before we hit the spin-off Psy-Trinity series. This book is different in terms of the fact that there is no main romantic couple, and it basically functions like a giant epilogue for the first part of the series, wrapping up a lot of threads and letting us get some closure on some of the couples that we won't see as much of in the next series. And I kind of adored it because it just felt really warm and cozy and like you were just revisiting all of these friends that you've known for a really long time. While that probably won't be for everyone, I really liked it because I'm a sucker for that sort of stuff. So we're going to talk about it. I'm going to put the book down because this one's the hardcover and it's quite heavy. So this book is also different in that it's told in different parts. So there are 8 parts to the story. Some are longer, some are shorter. And in fact, as you get closer towards the end of the book, the parts become shorter as they wrap up different storylines. And we also have a completely new story. Sorry, I should say there is a new romantic story in here, but it's one that's sort of been hinted at in previous books. And that is the relationship of a side character called Father Perez, who lost his love. And Father Perez is the friend of Judd and Caleb. We knew a couple of books ago that he's gone off in search of the woman that he lost in a Psy attack many years earlier. So we get their story told through letters that Father Perez has written to Nina over the years. And they're sort of interspersed throughout the story as he's on his journey to find her. So there is that story, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So as I said, in this book, we pretty much spend time with everyone that we have met previously, at least in some small part. There is an overarching sort of mystery, and that is the disappearance of another Black Sea member. And that is an ongoing thread, and it brings many of the characters together as they all participate in this search for her. The way that I'm going to talk about it, I'm literally going to go through the parts and just retell the story. I have adjusted some things so that I can talk about them in better context, but for the most part, this is going to be in order. So we open the book and we find out that there has been talk of Naya on the Psynet, and Naya is the Psy-Changeling daughter of Lucas and Sasha, who were the original couple in the first book. She's the first Psy-Changeling child to be born in a very long time, and many of the Psy are curious about her, but there's also some people who have some dodgy intent, and so everyone's a little bit nervous and wary about this happening. So much so that at one point Judd goes to Caleb and asks him to keep an eye on the chatter in the net around Naya because Snowdancer and Dark River have close ties and they're looking out for each other. And at the same time that they're having that conversation, they're also having a conversation around Father Perez and his journey through South America, and they're wondering how their friend is. We also have a really gorgeous scene where Sasha, Ashire and Faith are basically babysitting a whole bunch of Dark River cubs and some of their human playmates as well at a park, and then they're joined by Judd and Marley and also Vasek Abbott and some of the Arrow children. And so there's this gorgeous little scene where they're all out on a play date in a park, and I mean, doesn't that just give you warm fuzzy feelings? Because seriously, it gives me them. So in the previous books, we know that Aiden came up with the idea of the Trinity Accord, which is an agreement between all the major players in the world to kind of create peace and harmony between the groups as much as they can. And the villain that we would like to see dealt with very soon, sooner rather than later, Ming, has not been allowed to sign the Trinity Accord, mostly because everyone hates him. And so at the start of this book, he is still petitioning to try and sign the Accord, and there's a lot of discussion around whether or not they can deny him the right to sign it, or if there's a way that they can come up with it looking like it's a fair decision not to let him sign the Accord. So there's a lot of that sort of political maneuvering going along in the background. And then we have John and some of the Dark River juveniles who are out in the city, and they find this message in a bottle that washes up on the shore, and they let Lucas know, and the message inside is from a supposed Black Sea changeling called Layla Sabay, who seems to have been kidnapped. And she's written this letter and thrown it in the ocean in the hopes that someday someone might find it and maybe find out what happened to her. Then Lucas obviously contacts Black Sea to let them know that they've got this message, and so thus begins that mystery. Mercy is also still pregnant at this point in the book. In fact, she's pregnant for basically the entirety of this book, and the ongoing joke has been how many babies she's going to have, because she knows that she's having more than one, but she won't reveal to anyone how many she is actually having. There's also the bet going on whether she's having wolf pups or leopard cubs, but she's so heavily pregnant now that she's no longer doing many of her duties, and so the Dark River and Snowdancer healers decide that it would be really nice for both packs to have a party together since they've become such good allies, and that everyone recommends that Mercy be in charge of planning it to give her something to do and something to look forward to. One of the most adorable scenes in the entire book is a scene that takes place within the Snowdancer pack, and in particularly in their white zone, which is sort of the really safe space around the den where the children can play, because there's a lot of supervision by adults. It's very enclosed and covered and safe from outsiders. Judd and many of the other lieutenants are out there supervising the kids who are playing, and they end up in a giant water fight, which Judd kind of escalates. And it is a really fun scene. The entire thing is told from his perspective, because we see the full extent of his arc from the first book until now, where he was a very silent, very stoic, very serious character, to the fact that he is laughing his head off at the antics of anyone and everyone around him, including inciting a water fight amongst the lieutenants, and then ending up in a mud brawl, and then ending up in a river with Brenna. And it was just such a lovely scene to read. Okay, granted, I'm biased because he's my favourite character, but I loved reading that scene. We switch then to Caleb, and Caleb has been welcomed into the Mercant family by the matriarch Ina Mercant, who is the grandmother of Silver. And we knew from the previous book that there was talk around the Mercants really seeing Caleb as being part of their family. And the Mercants are a family of Psy who are very loyal. They are almost kind of like power brokers within the net. They have a lot of spies, they have a lot of knowledge and information, and once they accept you as their own, that's it, your family, and they will treat you as such, and you have their loyalty. And Ina is kind of scary, but also completely awesome. So she pops up again in Silver Silence, so it was nice that we get this little lead into that book through the wrap up to this part of the series. And then after that, we also see from Caleb's perspective that the Netminds have contacted him to let him know that despite everything that they've done in previous books, the Psy-Net is still dying. It might be a bit slower, but it's still degrading, and they still don't know why. Caleb also has meetings with the Empathic Collective, which is headed up by Ivy, who is Vasik's partner, and Ivy stands up to Caleb quite well. And so he contacts Sahara and basically says, stop making me appear trustworthy to the empaths, because that's not cool. And that is entirely Caleb down to a T. But Caleb does show Ivy what is happening in the net. And so Ivy is now working on the problem, trying to figure out exactly what is going on. Meanwhile, we switch back to Dark River, and Naya shifts for the first time into a leopard. And Sasha is both delighted and terrified because suddenly her baby is now able to run around and do all sorts of crazy things. And we also see that the Consortium is plotting to kidnap Naya. And the Consortium is the new big bad for the world. Essentially, basically, this first part is really check-ins with all of the groups. So we then switch to the Arrows, and we find out that they're really settling in and becoming more of a community. We also find out that Samuel Rain, who is a side character in Vasik's book, is still trying to build him a working prosthetic, despite the amusement of everyone around him and the fact that Vasik doesn't really necessarily want a working prosthetic, but he's sort of indulging Samuel because he saved his life. Zyra takes the lead in investigating the disappearance of Layla Survey in terms of the Arrows who are investigating the case. And we also find out that Vasik has taken Tavish, who was one of the Arrow children we met in the previous book, into his family group and is looking after him like a son. And that Tavish is spending a lot of time with Zyzen, who is Vasik's great-grandfather. And in probably the greatest redemption scene in the entire series, because we all know my feelings on Vaughn from book 2, who was just overbearing. But Vaughn in this book gets a gorgeous scene where he and Faith are babysitting Naya. He's mellowed. And I think that's not only the benefit of the fact that the books have probably been written, nearly 10 years or so apart, but also it's just nice to see that these characters have settled and are balanced better, because Faith and Vaughn's relationship was initially very imbalanced in terms of power dynamics, but now that they've spent more time together, they're very even. And it was just a gorgeous scene, and to see how this little child who they all love and adore just holds their attention and keeps them focused and makes them enjoy themselves was just so beautiful. But in the scene, while Faith and Vaughn are looking after Naya, they're also talking about everything that happened, and Faith is talking about how her father Anthony and her brother Tanique are planning on being in town for a little while, and Faith is very curious to spend some time with her brother, who she doesn't really know very well. And then she realizes that they could actually ask Tanique to get a read off the message in a bottle that the boys found at the beach, because Tanique is a psychometric, so he can touch things and get an impression of their past. And so they contact Anthony and Tanique, and he agrees to do it. And he does get a really brief impression of this bottle, and it leads back to a place called Edward's Pier. The Changelings pass the information on to Black Sea, who begin the investigation into it. And then we constantly cut back to Mercy, who's planning this party for the two changeling groups. And one of my favourite lines in the entire book is a message that Mercy sends Sasha while she's planning that says, "I think Lucas and Hawk should do the tango to open the party. Yes? P.S. Update on pup cubs. I am still 14 months pregnant." If you know the characters of Lucas and Hawk, yeah, everyone thinks that's a hilarious idea and everyone thinks that it is something that they should definitely do. We also have Lucas suggesting that Sasha should take Naya to meet her grandmother Nikita because that hasn't happened yet and Sasha's very reluctant to do it. But, you know, the fact that it came as a suggestion from Lucas is a big deal because he doesn't trust Nikita at all, but he also trusts that she'll take care of her daughter and granddaughter. And then at the very end of this first part of the book, Dark River and the Rat Changelings discover that there are a team of mercenaries who have arrived in San Francisco, and when Sasha and Naya and Dorian are travelling home from work to Pact Territory, they are attacked by said mercenaries in their car, and Sasha is able to incapacitate all of them using her powers, which is the first time she's ever used them offensively. And it's not a pretty thing because she basically turns all of their fears and insecurities against them. As they're investigating this attack, it leads back to a changeling pack called the Sky Elm Ocelots, who apparently hired the mercenaries to kidnap Naya. So then we hit part 2 of the book. So we really spent a lot of time with Dark River in the first part. So this time we switch to a little bit more to a focus on some of the Snow Dancer characters. It opens with Sienna heading back into the den to find out that Hawk has gone off to a meeting with Ming without her and taken Judd with him. This is infuriating to Sienna because she thinks it's a sign that he doesn't trust her, whereas we find out when Hawk comes back that he's intentionally buying up businesses and undercutting Min to get back at him because at the moment he's been asked not to kill him. So instead he's basically trying to undercut all of Ming's business interests in the States. Hawk is also contacted by Pax Marshall, who was introduced in the previous book, and he is another very powerful, very prominent Psy figure, and he has a business proposal for Snow Dancer, and Hawk assigns Cooper to that to find out if it's legitimate and to see if it's a good deal for them. When we switch back into some of the Dark River storylines, Lucas goes to visit Dorian and Ashire, and Dorian is playing with Keenan, and Keenan has started calling Dorian Dad, which is very sweet. Dorian is kind of beside himself about this fact. But Ashire also tells them that the Human Alliance implants that she's been investigating, the ones that Bowen and many of his team have had implanted in their brains to protect them from Psy interference, she believes that they're going to start to degrade and very quickly. She doesn't have all the evidence yet, so she's still investigating it, but she's very concerned that it's going to end badly. Having been there at the attack and attempted kidnapping of Naya, Dorian has been investigating the Ocelot pack that apparently hired the group. He discovers that the pack that once had 93 members now only has 7, and that many of them were killed in the bouts of violence that broke out when the Psynet collapsed and many of the Psy went crazy in previous books. And Lucas flies out to go and meet the alpha of that pack, and he's flown out in Nikita's private jet by Max, who of course he has his pilot license. And when he actually gets to Sky Elm, he confronts Monroe Hallister, who is the alpha of the pack, who has basically gone mad and thought that hiring assassins to kidnap another alpha's daughter would somehow help his pack. And so Lucas is forced to kill him, but he also invites the remaining members of the pack. So they had a healer, they had a submissive, they had 2 junior soldiers and 2 cubs. Lucas invites them to become members of Dark River, and they accept that and they come in because they're horrified that their alpha did that. Then we come to part 3, which opens with a birthday dinner at Vasek and Ivy's place, and Zaizen is there and he's watching Vasek and Tavish play soccer and ruminating on the fact that the man that he considers his son, his family, is able to play and laugh and enjoy life. And as he's watching them, Zaizen passes away, which is just devastating. And that has ramifications and ripple effects through most of the community, because Zaizen was someone who was connected to many, many people and has been involved in the books almost from the very start. We have a very brief scene at Zaizen's memorial where everyone comes together, or everyone who knew Zaizen comes together, and Vasek begins to take note of the people who had Zaizen's complete trust. And anyone who was sort of a member of his inner circle had these little coins that said that they were someone that he had complete trust in. And that includes Vasic and Anthony Kyriakis. It also includes Clara Alvarez, who is the J-Psy who runs Haven, which was the facility that Zyzen and Anthony set up to support those Psy who would have otherwise been rehabilitated. Sidestepping back into the story of Ming, who has not been allowed to sign the Trinity Accords, ends up coming up with his own European, what does he call it? The European Alliance for those people who want to align themselves with him. Because of course he comes up with his own because he's bitter like that. There's a meeting of the Dark River Sentinels, and the only thing I want to mention from this is that Mercy and Dorian remain my favourite bestest friends in book series because they are just so adorable. They were my favourites back when we had their books, and they're my favourites still to this day because they banter and they treat each other like siblings, and it's glorious. Black Sea believe that they have a lead on Layla's disappearance, and so they contact Vasic, who is able to teleport them into Edward's Pier, which they have discovered, and they find out that they've arrived there too late. But they also bring in Tanique to see if he can get a read on the building, and it's very overwhelming for him because the entire building has memories. As such, we sort of get the cost of that kind of ability and that kind of power on an individual. What he does get a read on is that she's being held somewhere with water, which makes sense because she's a Psy-Changeling, but he's not able to be more specific than that. And the Empathic Collective also meet, and what they begin to realize is that there are very stable pockets on the Psynet that are free from degradation and from illness and anything like that. And one of those pockets centers around Sophia, who is the J-Psy from Max's book. Her area is stable, and the stability is slowly sort of creeping out from wherever she is. And so that prompts them to start looking for other pockets just like Sophia's to see if they can find out what the connection is. In part 4, Aiden visits with Remy, who was the alpha that he met in his book, and we find out that they're still in constant contact. They're talking about how to lead a pack because Remy was quite a new alpha, and Aiden was trying to set up the Arrow community. And they also talk about how to have parties, and the Changelings have quite big, wild, rambunctious parties, whereas Aiden would need to adapt that. But he is actively trying to find ways to give his people those experiences that they haven't had, and ways to connect with others. Lucas is then in contact with a alpha from Calgary's Ice Rock Lynx pack, and her name is Kaya, and she lets him know that because there is some suspicion that they might know something about the Black Sea Changeling disappearances, but what it turns out is that they have been keeping an eye on an unknown corporation that has sort of taken up residence on neighbouring property to them, and they have a ginormous pool on property, and that prompts everyone to start investigating that area. Another really cute scene is when the Snow Dancer lieutenants go and have their meeting at Mercy and Riley's place, because Mercy obviously can't travel and Riley doesn't really want to leave her. And while they're there, they're all giving Mercy presents for the upcoming birth of the pup cubs, and Hawk gives the best presents. Honestly, he really does, because he was the one who gave Naya the wolf toy that she adores and drives Lucas nuts. So basically he gives her a bunch of baby clothes, one of which says Snow Dancer's rules across it, and then there's a whole stack of them that are all just sort of Snow Dancer branded, and also a set that say Pup Cub, which is really cute. And prior to that, she's very suspicious about why Hawk is giving her presents, and Mercy calls him on the fact that he's basically trying to mess with Lucas, because Lucas is Mercy's alpha. It's just delightful because they're this giant big family. You guys know how I feel about found family, and they're a giant extended found family, and they're spending time with one another, and I'm really excited about it. All right, part 5. Vasic and Black Sea plan to go to Calgary to the supposed giant pool area to see if they can rescue Layla, but when they get there they find out that she's already been moved, but they are able to get a hold of some of her captors, and they don't live long after that because everyone is very annoyed. Caleb continues to look for stable areas in the net that match the same sort of parameters as Sophia's, and what he discovers is that Clara Alvarez has an area like that around her, and so does Stefan Berg. So Clara and Stefan are both Psy, but they are also Psy who are mated to humans, and their area of stability matches the same as Sophia's, and she's also mated to a human. Ivy begins to pick up on that pattern, and basically they realize that the Psynet had always previously been supported by all 3 races, because there were a lot of marriages and relationships that tied the Psy to both the changelings and to the humans, and once silence hit, that was all basically cut out. And so they lost the input of the different types of minds into the Psy-Net, which has basically made it so unstable. In part 6, Ashaya finally confirms that the Human Alliance implants are failing and they probably won't last long, and they also can't be removed from the hosts. Going back to the fact that the Psy-Net needs more humans connected to Psy in order to stabilize the net, Nikita's suggestion is the wondering on whether or not they can coerce or psychically coerce humans into forming connections with the Psy, to which everyone is like, no, Nikita, we can't do that. That would be wrong. So it's nice to see that not that many things have changed with Nikita. We also find out that Nikita is still struggling since her shooting in the previous book, so she's still in quite a bit of pain, and that Anthony is still looking after her and watching over her, because of course he is, because we want their romance. Every time I film one of these, that's what I talk about, and I still want it. Sasha also finally takes Naya to visit Nikita, who is very put out because she's concerned about the security risk of Naya being there, but also Naya just crawls all over her grandmother and hangs out with her in bed. And I'm pretty sure, I can't remember if she changes into a leopard while she's there. But anyway, Nikita is charmed in a very Nikita way, which is to say that she doesn't really appear charmed, but we know that she is. And meanwhile, a Human Alliance member, Isaac, ends up stumbling across a convoy of cars that are traveling, and he thinks he sees Layla in the car, and so he follows them, and he ends up rescuing her from her captors and returning her to the Black Sea Changelings. In part 7, Mercy finally gives birth. She has 3 children. She has Bella, who is a leopard cub, and she has Ace and Micah, who are pups, and everyone is delighted and everyone comes to visit her, and so there are a lot of very cute scenes with babies because we've been waiting for these babies to be born for many books now. It's in this part that Father Perez finally tracks down Nina, so the whole way through the story we've had those letters that are explaining their history and their past and what he did to try and find her. And he comes across her in a small remote village, and he finds out that as a result of the attack that separated them many years ago, she is now blind and she has not been able to access adequate medical treatment in order to fix that. But they're just so overcome by finding one another, and he was concerned that Nina wasn't going to forgive him for leaving, and she is just grateful that he has come back and that he's alive and well. And Father Perez finally asks her to marry him, and he also asks for the assistance of Caleb and Judd, and so Judd puts him into contact with Mercy's grandmother, who is the alpha of the Azure Sun leopard pack in South America, and Caleb also starts a humanitarian foundation for Father Perez so that Father Perez can continue to help the local communities in South America where he's planning on staying with Nina, which is just a gorgeous little wrap up of that story since we've been told snippets of it since book 3. I like conclusions to things, that makes me happy. Part 8 is really super short. There's not a huge amount that happens in it aside from the fact that we see that Bowen has now got a really strong connection with Black Sea because he sits down and has a beer with Malachi, and they talk about all sorts of just regular everyday things. And then we also see that that Aiden has implemented a party for the arrows, and it's a very structured, very sedate kind of party, but it's their first party and they're trying, and I love it. All right, and then we hit part 9, which is the final part of the book. And at the very beginning of this section of the book, there is the suggestion that Pax Marshall might have been behind some of the attempts on Naya's life, but the changelings aren't quite convinced that that's the case, so that's on the back burner for now. And then we finally have the changeling party, so all of my found family people all in one place, and it's glorious. So there's all sorts of things that happen at this party, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, but some of the highlights for me were the fact that Hawk and Lucas flipped for the right to open the party, and Hawk won. You also have Hawk telling off a group of 13-year-old girls for dressing inappropriately to the party, and it's like, that is such a dad thing to do. There's a gorgeous scene where Walker dances with Marley, and we finally see that Walker is also loosening up around everyone. And we also find out that Lara's pregnant, and so Walker is having another child, and it's just beautiful. We all know my favourite little wolf cub, Ben. He's there. He's in a tuxedo, and isn't that the most adorable image in your mind? Tiny little children in tuxedos. It's just an adorable sight. And Ben and Marley need to grow up and have a book. That's all I'm saying. We all know that my favourite scene of the party would be anything that involves Judd, and Judd's scene of the party involves him basically holding on to a tiny little baby for an hour talking to Brenna. Again, adorable image, but also the scene is quite lovely because the two of them actually talk about whether or not they want to have children, and they both do, but they also go, you know, we're both young and that's not something that we need to rush into. And the whole scene is just quiet and gorgeous. And I think Brenna sums it up beautifully, going, seriously hot, seriously dangerous man with a tiny adorable baby in his arms, both of them fascinated with one another. Uncaring of her stunning ankle-length gown in poppy red, Brenna fell dramatically onto the ground, arms flung out. Dead. That would be me, just going. Gorgeous. Poor Caleb. Nalini Singh seems determined to force him to realise that he's not as bad a guy as he seems to think he is. So one of the sort of side characters who popped up in a novella and has sort of been in and out of the series, called Annie. Caleb is there, and Annie recognises Caleb as being the Psy boy who many years ago saved her when she was in an accident. And she's always been on the lookout for him to say thank you because she never got a chance to. And he's at the party and they have this moment, and it's really sweet because it's just another case of Caleb does have his moments where he actively helps other people even though he thinks that he's the bad guy all of the time. And he is, because he does terrible things, but he also does things to help other people, and he does it without recognition. And so Annie says thank you. And then because for her whole life she's had a limp as a result of the accident, he does something kind for her and he teleports her to a seat so that she can sit down. And then of course he gets inundated with all the little kids in the packs coming up to him and wanting to be teleported, to which he then asks Judd, do you find yourself being asked to be a personal teleporter all the time? I know I sound like a weirdo pulling out little random things from the books, but honestly, these scenes are just, when you've read all of the books and you have all of these things, all of these threads coming together and tying up, it's just so satisfying. To finish off the story, it ends on a sort of a bittersweet note because Kit, who is one of the Dark River soldiers, who since the very start of the book has been hinted at that he will one day be a future alpha, so one day he will leave the pack. He decides to leave. He doesn't go to the party, he sneaks off, and he's planning on roaming. And Lucas finds him and it's their farewell. I can't wait for Kit to get his own story because surely it's going to happen. He is such a sweetheart. And it will be amazing to have his book at some point in the future. Nalini Singh, I know you're not watching this video, but please, we just want Kit's book. Because he has been such a good character through the whole series. He's been a great friend to Sienna. I'm pretty sure, this is the problem, because I haven't reread many of the Psy-Trinity books. I know from memory that he's in there somewhere at one point, and I can't wait to visit with him again, now that he's a bit of a free agent. All right, I think I've rambled long enough about this book. It's my warm fuzzy book of the series because everything is just wrapping up and you get gorgeous scenes that don't mean much overall in terms of, they're not stories on their own. They're quiet moments that show us how these characters have grown and changed over 15 books. And I love it because I'm a bit of a sap like that. So that is the Psy-Changeling series done. Next stop, Psy-Trinity. I can't wait to reread Silver Silence. I'm really looking forward to rereading all of them, but I'm really looking forward to rereading Ocean Light because I'd forgotten so much about the Sea Changelings. So stay tuned, that's all coming up. And you know, if you've been watching these videos, thank you for sticking with me. We're continuing all the way through to Last Guard, and then hopefully for any future books. So in the comments, feel free to share any thoughts you've had on Allegiance of Honor. Feel free to agree or disagree with me. I'm happy to have the discussion. If you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, you can leave me any kind of green emoji, since green seems to be the theme of my edition of the book. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.